Hello and welcome back to our weekly AVIAtest webinar. Thank you for joining us, whether on YouTube or on the private viewing platforms. My name is Jeff. I will be your host tonight as every week. And it's, as always, a pleasure to welcome you to our webinar. Today, our webinar will be focused mainly on Flight Information Service and to see what use we can make of it as pilots, whether VFR or IFR. All right, let's begin the matter immediately. Okay, so Flight Information Service is a part of air traffic services, of course, like air traffic control service, for example, or alerting service. And it is generally available to any aircraft within a flight information region, or FIR, as ICAO tells us that it should be. So, more in detail, what exactly is Flight Information Service? It's a service that provides all flights with information pertinent to the safe and efficient conduct of flight. So remember here that it's both for safety and for efficiency. It includes information on potentially conflicting traffic, for example, and also meteorological information, or information on aerodromes if you need, information on airspaces, airspace activations, for example, the airspaces where you could find dangerous activity to the flight of aircraft. For example, if you have a restricted area also, it could provide you with that information. And Flight Information Service in itself can be provided to pilots independently from any other service. If you're flying, for example, in uncontrolled or Class Golf airspace. But it can very well also be provided together with other services, like, for example, air traffic control service. So it means that if you're flying in controlled airspace, if you're flying in a control zone, for example, and you're talking to a tower controller, at the same time as the controller is providing you with air traffic control service, he or she is also giving you flight information service within their area of jurisdiction, of course. And we'll come to that a little later. But what is important to know about this division of air traffic services is that depending on the classification of airspace where you're flying, the service that you will be receiving is, of course, different. If you fly in Class Golf airspace, most of the time you will just be receiving Flight Information Service. If you fly in Class Charlie or Class Delta or even Class Bravo, then it means that you will be receiving Air Traffic Control Service and Flight Information Service. Alright. Now, should I contact Flight Information Service is a question that many people ask me, and I don't know if any of them are connected now, but anyhow, it's of course one of the most important things to know about Flight Information Service. The answer to that is it depends on your flight rules, basically. The thing is, if you're flying in controlled airspace, where you will receive Flight Information Service as part of the bigger picture, as part of the Air Traffic Control Service, then of course the rules are of course the same as for the Air Traffic Control Service. So it means that you need to be in contact with Air Traffic Control, you need to be in contact with the controller, you need to receive that Flight Information Service just because it's grouped with something else that is mandatory. I hope this is clear for everybody. If you're in uncontrolled airspace, there the picture is a little bit different. Now, let's imagine that we were flying VFR in class Golf airspace. Well, no. In that case, you do not have to contact Flight Information Service, but we'll come to it in a while. Again, the thing is that it's always good to do it, and I will tell you why a little later, but strictly from a strictly legal point of view, you're not obliged, it's not mandatory for you to contact Flight Information Service. Now, if you're flying IFR, if you're flying instrument flight rules, now, if you're flying IFR outside controlled airspace, you may be one of the very, very few and far in between people who do that. That's extremely rare. Over the course of my 20 years of air traffic control, I think I saw one person flying IFR outside controlled airspace. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't or that you can't, but it certainly is somewhat tricky. We agree that flying IFR means that you're not looking out the window, basically, so you can't see the other traffic, because you could very well be that you're flying in IMC and the weather is so poor that you don't see the other traffic. Then flying in uncontrolled airspace is somewhat discutable, because, okay, it's mandatory for you, you're obliged to contact Flight Information Service, but the person who's answering to you, the controller or the Flight Information Services officer that's talking to you, may not know about all the traffic that is around you. So it may very well be that there's another aircraft just ahead, and the controller doesn't see the other aircraft, and you obviously can't see it either, just because it's so poor weather. So, by all means, I'm not saying it's forbidden to fly IFR outside controlled airspace, but as you can see, it's somewhat tricky, and if you asked me personally, I would probably not do it, and I would probably discourage a pilot to do it if I'm in the aircraft, but then to each their own. And if you want to do it, I'm nobody to prevent you from doing it, of course. So, once again, if you're flying outside controlled airspace, so class Foxtrot, a class Golf, you have to contact Flight Information Service, and you have to maintain a continuous two-way radio contact with them if you are IFR and not if you are VFR. Now, as I just said, there are two different classes of uncontrolled airspace, class Foxtrot and class Golf. Class Foxtrot is very, very extremely rare, and I personally don't even know any place where Foxtrot is available. But if it ever happens that you contact Flight Information Services because you're in class Foxtrot airspace, well, in that case you will still receive what is called Air Traffic Advisory Service, which is some sort of enhanced flight information service, and it's more of an advisory, as the name says. It's a service provided between aircraft which are operating IFR, of course, and where you're being given information and actually advice as to how to avoid the other IFR traffic. Now, of course, this is done insofar as practical. It means that the controller can't really have an influence on what you're doing and therefore on what the other are doing. So they will refrain themselves from giving you instructions or clearances, of course, because this is uncontrolled airspace. But still, they can tell you, all right, you have traffic at your 12 o'clock, same altitude. I advise left turn because traffic is proceeding left to right, for example. Or I advise overtaking the traffic by the right. That's also another solution if the traffic is going the same direction as you are. It's a little bit tricky. Once again, this is something, and that's why probably airspace class Foxtrot is not really that popular, because we're entering a little bit of a gray area where you will have people talking to you from the ground, giving you advice, but then what happens if there's an incident or an accident? Well, technically, you're still responsible for your separation because you're outside controlled airspace, but it's a very, very tricky thing to do, and that's, I'm guessing, probably why the states, the different countries are reluctant to use class Foxtrot airspace. Anyhow, once we have established all that, what can we expect from Flight Information Service? All right. The thing is, Flight Information Service can be either rendered as an aerodrome service or as an en route service. So it means that in some places, at some airports, you will have something called AFIS, which stands for Aerodrome Flight Information Service. It is flight information service provided at an aerodrome. Okay. These are typically airfields or aerodromes where, despite they're not busy enough for a complete air traffic control service, the traffic is such that some form of service is still recognized as necessary. And okay, you can probably see it as a halfway house between controlled and uncontrolled. But once again, what happens here is that instead of giving you clearances and instructions like you would receive it at a controlled aerodrome, you would receive information about the rest of the traffic, either people who have a radio and that you can hear, and normally you would hear them even if there was no AFIS, but also everything that the AFIS officer sees, either by looking out the window or on a situation display, on a radar display, if there's something like that, although it's not very likely. AFIS, Aerodrome Flight Information Service, is provided, of course, at the aerodrome, so on the ground, and in the surrounding airspace. You would receive traffic information, weather information, information about the status of the aerodrome, like what's the runway condition is, if the runway is wet or covered with something like slush or snow or things like that. Although I'm not sure it might be a very good idea to fly in that case. But still, okay, if you want to do it, you want to do it. I'm no one to say if you have skis fitted on your aircraft, it's perfectly okay to do it. Then, what else? You would also be able to ask the controller or the Flight Information Service officer, for some interaction with your flight plan, and that means that if you did file a flight plan, or if you ask that person to file a flight plan on your behalf, that these AFIS officers can activate a flight plan, can close a flight plan on your behalf, can delay, can amend a flight plan if you ask them to. So it can come in quite handy, because I'm sure it already happened to you that you created a flight plan, you filed it, and then when you reach the airplane, you say, no, I'm wrong, this is not what I intend to do, there's a small change. And then basically you need either to go back to the terminal, to go back to the aerodrome building, and call somebody, or call from your mobile and with a paper on your knee saying like, oh, but no, I wrote this, but this is not exactly true, and that's not what I want to do. Or I want to depart later or earlier. I need to do something with that flight plan, you know? So AFIS can also provide you with that kind of service that with just a radio call, you will be able to do these all these transactions straight on the radio with your party on the radio. Another thing that's important to know is that AFIS will monitor your arrival. So it means that once you file the flight plan, and if you don't make it in time, AFIS will start investigating if you don't show up at your arrival aerodrome in time, and start looking out for you if you really know where to be seen. Now, if they fail in all that, there are procedures, and we will try to address those in a later issue of this webinar, because we're unfortunately very time limited. But the whole point is that AFIS will make sure you land in time, and if you don't, they will start looking for you, and they won't give up until they find you, just like controllers would do. Alright, so that's also quite handy and quite good to know. But it means that if you land at an aerodrome without any service whatsoever, if it's an aerodrome where nobody is flying, or even nobody is on the ground waiting for you, just land there, put the aircraft on the apron, tie it down and go away. Don't forget to close your flight plan to announce that you made a diversion, so that people don't start looking for you needlessly, I would say. Okay, so AFIS, to finish this chapter, is a service that's very popular in some countries in Europe. For example, in France, or in Sweden or Denmark. Sweden or Denmark, they even have radar service in some of these aerodromes. Some of these AFIS aerodromes even have lighting for night operations, which can be quite handy. And I know that, for example, in France, what is very good is that if you call by phone beforehand the AFIS agents and tell them, okay, listen, tonight I'm going to fly to aerodrome, and I know that you won't be there, that AFIS will be closed, but if the aerodrome is still open, could you please leave the runway lights in automatic mode? This is something that many aerodromes can do, which means that the lights, the runway lights, the taxiway lights are switched off. But if you come on the frequency and follow a certain procedure, usually it's just a few clicks on the push to talk button, like 7 or 11 clicks on the push to talk button in your aircraft, then that will trigger the switching on of runway lights. It also can be quite handy if you intend to land after hours. Right. So that concludes it for AFIS. Now, the en-route flight information service is quite the same in terms of traffic avoidance. Of course, you will not receive any other service than just traffic information. All right? But apart from that, apart from traffic, there's a whole lot of other things that Flight Information Service can do for you, and that's, for example, provide you with weather information. They can give you SIGMET or AirMET, TAF, or METARS, for example, or SPECI even. They can pass you all this information that you receive in the pre-flight information bulletin that you were supposed to download before flight. And just before they can give it to you on the radio doesn't mean that it's an excuse for not picking it up before the flight, of course. You're still supposed to do your job as a pilot and pick up all this information before flight. But all right, we know that this information is very time sensitive, and that things can change while you are flying. A NOTAM can come up during your flight. Well, Flight Information Service knows about it, of course. And if you have a doubt about anything, or even if you don't, but your route crosses, let's imagine, a restricted area, it's always good practice to contact Flight Information and say, okay, let's imagine border information, Golf Alpha Bravo Charlie Delta, request status of restricted area Romeo 53, for example. The person who's doing Flight Information Service has all that information at a click of a mouse. So it means that they can find all the statuses of these areas very, very easily. And it means that you basically, with just one radio call, you can have access to a ton of information about airspaces, about serviceability of narrate, if you're still using a VOR or an NDB. Well, these people, they know, okay, let's imagine you're following a VOR radio, or you're trying to tune into a VOR and you don't receive a signal. Well, a very good thing is that you can ask Flight Information Service, hey, Golf Alpha Bravo Charlie Delta, I'm not receiving the signals from X-Ray Yankee Zulu VOR. Can you confirm the VOR is out of service? So you can check if the fault is within your receiver or with the transmitter on the ground. Right, that can be quite handy. What else? You can also receive information about balloons on the way, because balloons traditionally all of them don't call Flight Information Service, but at least they have to give notification of their flight before they take off. So it means that Flight Information Service will know if there are balloons in your way, if there are all sorts of aerial sporting activities, if you're crossing an area where gliders are operating, because usually the gliders are operating outside controlled airspace. Well, they know all these things. Be careful, because gliders are especially hard to see if it's a beautiful day, like it is most of the time here, not really today, but most of the time. And it's sunny outside, you're in a big blue sky. Gliders are very, very thin, very small, and very difficult to see. Well, at least if you ask, or if Flight Information Service tells you, caution, you're about to cross an area with glider activity, you can keep a sharper lookout, even sharper than usual. What else? They can also tell you, right, your aerodrome of destination is closed, so don't even think about going there, because today's a day off. It happened to me actually once that I was planning to fly to Switzerland, and in Switzerland there was a day off, a national holiday, and nobody was aware of that. So fortunately the controller that was working the Flight Information Service in Munich told us, yeah, by the way, I see you've filed a flight plan to Switzerland, but you can't go there because it's closed today. So you see, there's a whole lot of information that's available. Or for example, if you get lost, you can also ask for information about your positioning. If you need to divert in flight, that's also something that happened to me. It's very, very handy, especially if you don't know the area, if you're on a long cross-country flight, if you're crossing countries you've never been to, and all of a sudden you need to divert for any reason. Call Flight Information Service, say, okay, listen, this is what's happening, I need to divert. Can you recommend an aerodrome close to me? And they will be more than happy to help. So, what can't you ask to Flight Information Service? This is quite interesting. Basically, Okay, apart from anything that's not related with aviation, I mean, I'm sure these people have a lot of general culture, general wisdom, but it's not the point of the service. If you asked what age was Winston Churchill when he died, some of them may know because they're very, very clever people, but it's really not the purpose of the job. But on the other hand, flight information service will become limited inversely proportionally to the amount of traffic that they have. So of course it's perfectly okay to ask a flight information service officer, could you call the controllers in the class Delta airspace in front of me and ask them for a crossing clearance? I know that, for example, the Swiss flight information services do that quite a lot. They even offer it before you ask. They will call you and say, like, Hotel Bravo Alpha Bravo Charlie, you're about to enter Zurich TMA, do you want me to call my colleague and ask for crossing clearance? And if you say affirm, then they will gladly call and then come back to you, okay, Zurich approach tells me that you're cleared to cross class Delta in front of you, maintaining 3,000 feet, for example, giving you all sorts of conditions, but it's still something that they can do. What is important is that if you hear that there's a lot of traffic, if there's a lot of aircraft on the frequency, maybe rely on yourself and do these things yourself, because the time that the controller has to share for you is of course limited. All right? So don't ask a flight information service to file a flight plan on your behalf if you hear that there are 20 other aircraft on the frequency. It will not work. The controller or the flight information services officer will probably tell you, okay, look, sorry buddy, but I have too much work. I can't do it right now because filing a flight plan would require you to dictate your route one point after the other. It's going to take a long frequency time, and I really don't have time for that at the moment. Right? So if you want to file a flight plan for the purpose of crossing controlled airspace, well, call the controlled sector and just ask for a crossing clearance. That's a much better way to do it. Also, something that people don't know is that flight information services for flight over large water areas could help you if you want to locate a ship. You say, okay, I don't know my position, but I have a ship just below me. In some parts of the world, they have this kind of information available. And also, there are the people to talk to if, it's an example, all right? But if you see somebody in problems or in distress on the ground or on the water, if you see that, for example, a boat has capsized on the sea or on the lake, you can tell Flight Information Service passing a pan message, pan. I'm at this position, and just below me is a boat that's in difficulty, and could you please send something or send help for them? And the Flight Information Services officer will reach out to the appropriate authorities and try to send help. Even if, for example, it's a forest fire, or you see animals stuck engulfed in a forest fire, that's also something that can be useful. All right. So we have received quite a few questions this week. So if you have more, please, it's good. It would be a good moment to send them online. But we're going to start now with the viewer questions. All right, welcome back. And we are delighted to answer some of the questions from our most assiduous viewers, as well as from our new viewers. All right. So let's start with the first question that we received by email from Emil in Slovakia, who asks us, how can I get a Flight Information Service Officer license? Well, that's a very good question, and I'm happy that you're considering the career, Emil. Now, Flight Information Service Officer licenses are not exactly something that are universally regulated. There are provisions set forth by ICAO. I went through them because I have to admit that I was not familiar with all the regulations, but thanks to your question, I got to brush up on them. Usually, Flight Information Services Officer licenses are issued by the ANSP themselves, so by the air navigation service providers themselves, or by the CAA of your country. Now, I looked up the particular situation in Slovakia, of course, since you write me from there, and in Slovakia at the moment, the situation is that there are no FISO licenses as such. You would have to undergo training provided by the ANSP of your country, which is called LPS SR. And after a series of exams, then you would be entitled to man the position in Bratislava Information, which is the only FIS service in Slovakia. If your goal, Emil, is to go work abroad as a Flight Information Services Officer, obviously it depends where you want to do it. There are some countries like Spain, like United Kingdom, like Sweden, like Denmark, where you could probably land a job if you have a proper FISO license. And your question then is, of course, extremely valid. How do you get this license? It's very easy. There are nowadays a few commercial companies that will help you gaining an FISO license. Now, depending on the country where you want to go, of course, the regulations may be different and may require on-the-job training, which a commercial company, of course, will not be able to provide. But at least you would be able to go to a prospective employer saying, listen, I already have a theoretical license, and if you're just willing to give me your JTI, then our JTI is standing for on-the-job training instruction, then I would be able to work for you quite quickly. That's something that I think could work quite easily. I'm not going to advertise commercial companies on this webinar because this is really not the point of all this. But Emil, if you want to write me again, we can discuss it more privately, and I can maybe give you some directions, some pointers as to where you could find training for that. But if your goal is to do that job in Slovakia, then I would refer you to the ANSP of your country, LPSSR. And again, if you need pointers, if you need contacts, you can write me, and I will be very happy to forward you with directions, with pointers, with ideas how to achieve your goal. All right. So that was for Emil from the Slovak Republic. Now, Anna from Sweden asked me, can I ask the Flight Information Center for the opening hours of the aerodrome where I want to fly, and if I see that my landing is going to be too tight, can I ask them to extend these opening hours? Well, Anna, for the first part of your question, of course, go ahead by any means, don't hesitate, ask, and the FISO will inform you of the opening hours, of the restrictions, of any any information pertaining to the current status of the aerodrome where you want to fly. As for extending the opening hours, there it might be a little bit more complicated because you have to realize that the people who work there, and I know that they love their job. I loved my job as an air traffic controller, but we have regulations as well as to our working times. And there are also regulations governing the opening times of the aerodromes. So it's not always up to the controller or up to the AFIS officer to decide whether the aerodrome can stay open or not. Most of the time, actually, it's not. Most of the time, their hands are tied as well. So you can ask, but the chance that you will be given that extension are unfortunately very, very thin. Still, asking doesn't cost anything, and the worst that could happen is that they say no. So by all means, don't be shy. As with anything, once you're in flight, don't be shy. Ask. The third question for today, because that's unfortunately all what we will have time for, is it normal that flight information service officers ask me to report over certain points? Sorry, that question came from Frank, and Frank was writing us from Marseille in France. Okay. Frank? It's a little bit touchy, actually. I'll be honest with you. Strictly speaking, no. Flight Information Services Officer may not give you instructions. It's not within the scope of their duties, sorry. And if they give you an instruction and you don't follow it, nothing much can be done about it. They can't file a report on you because they asked you to report something and you didn't do the report. But usually, if they ask you to report something, there is a good reason behind it. As with air traffic controllers, remember that these people working there are professionals. And we rarely, as air traffic services professionals, do things, we very, very rarely do things to annoy people. And we actually never do things to annoy people. There is always a good reason why you will be asked to do or to say or to report something. And even if it's somebody who doesn't really have the authority to ask you to do something, I would still report what you're asked to report. Because maybe there's something that you don't know and that would be problematic if you didn't report. Now, I'm not saying that the way to do it is right, of course. And the FIS officer should probably try other strategies, other tactics to convey the information that they want to convey, or warn you of something. Sorry, I beg your pardon. So it means that they probably should have used a different method, but still, I think that they ask you to do things with a good intention. And it's probably a good idea to, I don't want to say comply because it's not really complying since it's not officially an instruction, but it's a good idea to do what you're being asked, because not only you will gain the trust of the person on the other side, and also you may have information made available to you quicker or in a more efficient way. All right? So if there are a flight information services officer watching, because I know that on some of our private platforms we may have quite a few, let me tell you this. I've been a controller. I did flight information service. I gave flight information service sometimes outside of my control zone as part of air traffic control service. I know that it's a very, it can be a very sour job. It can be very ungrateful. But try to avoid at all costs giving instructions to pilots, and it can be very, can be very insidious, can be very subtle. Sometimes just telling somebody, report approaching that CTR, or report that city in sight, is actually an instruction. And the problem of doing that is that you may give pilots a false feeling of security. Because if you tell somebody, report this or report that or do this or do that, they will start thinking, oh, that's nice. Actually, I'm receiving much more service than I bargained for. This is almost like an air traffic control service. So if I do all what I'm asked, then maybe I'll even receive extra things. And that's not the case. We all know that we will not give traffic. We will give traffic information, but we will not give instructions to avoid traffic. And by starting to give instructions like that, pilots will start expecting more and more, and that's really not good, because by doing that, we risk creating that false feeling of safety, which is detrimental to all of us, basically, both pilots and controllers and flight information services officers. All right. So, this wraps up today's webinar. My name is Jeff. I'm very happy to have welcomed you. Stay tuned for more episodes. Next week, we will again be tackling a very interesting subject, which I keep quiet over for the moment. I'll let you discover it very shortly. Stay safe, stay healthy. I know that in this climate and in this world crisis, health crisis, I know it's sometimes difficult, but we're here. We are by your side, and we hope that everybody will be able to go fly again very shortly everywhere around the world. In the meantime, stay safe, stay healthy, and until next week, have a nice evening, and see you next week. Bye-bye.